talking about,
Sorry about that.
we first began talking about the fact that somebody needed to do something. When I say somebody needed to do something, we were speaking to each other at that moment as four white Christian women who were just appalled. That's not strong enough a word to use by what we had seen happen at the Capitol, and particularly appalled by the presence of a large cross with the Trump flags and the American flags, and then of course the violence that took place, and uh, the overall effect of what was going on at the Capitol on the afternoon of January the 6th. So when Susan and Ann Gilson, who was also from Brevard, and Darlene Odell, who at the time was from Brevard but is now in Asheville, started talking about the fact that we wanted to do something, we realized we were all writers and we all enjoy research, and we would start working together on something. So to make a long story, it's a very long story, and we can talk about it around the edges someday when we bump into each other. But the four of us met for a long time, every 2 or 3 weeks, to talk about what we had been working on. And the four of us were going off in somewhat different but parallel directions in looking at this. And my direction was the seven deadly sins, because I had just somehow, I'm a theologian, and was so interested in going into what Christianity has done to aid and abet what had happened. And so by September, it became apparent that the publisher, that we had worked with several publishers who had said no to us, but one publisher said yes to the seven deadly sins of white Christian nationalism, did not have room or space in their imagination for all the other parts that we had been working on. And so with my sister's blessings, I took off and finished the project on the seven deadly sins of white Christian nationalism over the next few months. And it was published about 9 or 10 months later in September of 2022. But I see Susan is with us now, and I want very much, Susan, to invite you into any part of this conversation. Hi there, because Susan and I have over the last several years talked a lot about all of this together. And she is not only one of my dearest friends, but I learned so much from her about all of this in an ongoing way. So that's how it all began personally. And as Terry said, I write a lot about myself personally in the first chapter, because as a theologian, I've always believed it's important to try to locate yourself in what you're trying to say about the sacred or good and evil or whatever, because that way people know where you're coming from. And I really always loved teaching theology to invite my students to do the same, to bring themselves into theological discussion and not try to pretend that it is, in quote, objective, because it really isn't. Um, Objectivity is a great thing, but we still bring ourselves into whatever it is we're attempting to be objective about. Um, so let's go to the first uh, slide, Terry, which is what is white Christian nationalism? And I'll show you the definition we were working with from the outset. We borrowed this from sociologists Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, whom you may have heard on various TV or radio programs, because they often are called to discuss Christian nationalism, and we talk about it as white Christian nationalism because white supremacy and racism is so deeply entrenched in it, its American version. But they say that cultural Christian nationalism is a cultural framework, and that's important there because it's not a religion. It's a cultural framework, a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life, and includes assumptions of nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronormativity, along with divine sanction for authoritarian control and militarism. Um, Again, it's not a religion. It's really larger than a religion. It's the context in which religions develop and get skewed and what all, and it becomes a way of for Christians of thinking about Christianity, both positively and negatively. Let's go on to the next page, Terry. White Christian nationalism was seeded and has been growing in America from the very beginning of our country. But in this book, I focus on the last 75 or 80 years, which is basically my own lifetime since World War II, in which we have seen a strengthening of an unholy alliance, or what I would suggest is an unholy trinity of the coming together of business, government, and Christianity, more specifically, big corporate, wealthy business, the Republican Party in this country, and culturally conservative forms of Christianity, both Protestant and Catholic and Orthodox. So it's not all Christians, it's not all government, and it's not all business, but it's that corporate interest together with the Republicans' pretty much self-proclaimed mission over the last 70 or 80 years, and the most culturally conservative forms of the Christian church in our nation. And to be honest, it's not really all of the most culturally conservative Christian churches. It's a segment of those. There's whatever war going on among the conservative Christian churches as well, but a chunk of them have been broken off and have become MAGA churches, and very proudly so. And that's where you'll see the Trump and Jesus flags flying, or hear people talking about, Jesus is my savior and Trump is my Lord, or Jesus is my Lord and Trump is my savior, or, variations of that, of this very, to me, chilling theme. But what I've listed here on this slide are, and we're not going to go through all of these in any detail at all, but in the book, I do talk in some detail about the people, events, and movements you see on the left there, and the pivotal court decisions you see on the right there, with the addition of the Dobbs decision more recently, because it was after the book was published. But just pointing out that people and events and movements for over the last 70 or 80 years have given us what is this white Christian nationalism. I just read several months ago the Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, how the FBI aided and abetted the rise of white Christian nationalism, written by Lerone A. Martin, who teaches history at Stanford University. And it's a horrifying book, not too surprising to me, because it's pretty clear to me, even as a very young woman, that J. Edgar Hoover was up to what I would consider no good in terms of his agenda for America. But I didn't realize how Christian it was. He was using the Christian churches, and there's a stained glass window in a Presbyterian church, I believe it is, in Washington, D.C., that is dedicated to him. And he managed to use prayer and Christian faith, both Catholic and Protestant. And this was really pretty new, because Catholics and Protestants had not done a lot of cooperating in matters of faith over the history of America. There had often been tensions between them. But he would hold these retreats for new FBI agents, and white male agents would be not only invited, but required to go to these retreats, where in some cases Jesuit priests would lead the retreat. One of his buddies was a Jesuit priest. In other cases, Protestant ministers would lead these retreats. And Jews were not allowed to go, women were not allowed to go, people of any color, and especially Black people and brown people, were not allowed to attend these retreats, even though they were all FBI agents as early as the 1950s and 60s. So that's our J. Edgar Hoover. Joe McCarthy, you know about McCarthyism and McCarthy hearings. The civil rights movement became a huge matter of fear and agitation among white Americans, because, and on the right, it was, well, it really was believed, but also it was promoted that Black people really were going to take over this country, that that's what civil rights was about. If you have listened to Mark Robinson, who is running for governor of North Carolina right now, he calls the civil rights movement a communist plot. And in it, he said it's a plot to distribute wealth from the top to the bottom so that the bottom can rise up and take over America, the bottom being Black people. Great source of anxiety and fear. The Vietnam, and then I write in my book about King, Malcolm X, and Muhammad Ali. As a young woman, I knew very little about Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, except for the fact that I was scared of them. I was scared of Black Muslims. I was scared of Black Panthers. I was a good little white Southern girl. I was scared of too much Black power. Not having a clue that that's part of the white agenda for this country is to frighten us about Black people having power and Black people rising into the fullness of who they are and somehow believing that if they do, then we who are white are lowered. That's part of the ideology, part of the cultural framework of white Christian nationalism. You can read more about this in the book. The Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, great anxiety among white middle class and upper class people in our country. And I and many other people on this Zoom with white hair and no hair and hair of any color may have also been part of the Vietnam protest in our day. But this was very frightening to white Christian people in this country. And at the time, those of us who were kids and in our early 20s heard a lot about that. Then comes Ronald Reagan, and 1981, he became president. And the Republicans today love to talk about him as the great hero, he's sort of the Republican icon. I don't know that that's true any longer, given what's happened to the Republican Party, but until very recently, Reagan was held up as a very heroic character. In fact, I propose in this book, and I propose in general, that a lot of what we're experiencing today as injustice is seated in the Reagan doctrine of trickle-down economics. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer is really the way it works. But the theory was as the rich get richer, the poor get what is left over and can rise up with that. But Reagan came along and the economic gap in our country began to broaden and deepen, and it's gotten only worse since then. I list the fairness doctrine in my book because the fairness doctrine, I forget whether it's 1986 or 87, but it was part of Reagan's plan, was to eliminate the need for public broadcasting to include all sides if they were to get any kind of financial help. And after the fairness doctrine was eliminated and was no more, people like Rush Limbaugh came to the fore. And AM radio became a largely right-wing social media vehicle, and that's still true today. And then it's 4 or 5 years later, I think it was that maybe 10 years later, Fox News came into being, and we know how media is working right now. We see how the divisions in our country are themselves a product of how the news gets reported on either side, and the powers that be, not so much the Democrats at this point. I mean, and when I am talking in this book and on this Zoom about Democrats and Republicans, no question, I am a Democrat, but I have in my lifetime voted for Republicans, and I have nothing against Republicans who love this country and who love justice and who disagree with me or Democrats about how we affect what it is we are working toward. I think that's healthy government, to have a healthy two-party system where you have parties that have very different philosophies about economic productivity and how we get there, and who have very different priorities, but who all love the country and who all denounce violence and who all denounce the divisiveness that we're experiencing right now. So right now, I'm a passionate Democrat, and I believe that only work by people who are adamant about not letting Trump and his agenda win can work together to save democracy in this country. So I'm saying that very clearly in this book and in this Zoom. And if anybody would like to disagree with me on that, we certainly can talk about it. But I think it's that urgent an agenda, and I'm saying this really as a Christian theologian. And I think a lot of the stuff began with Reagan, and one of my chief mentors, herself a Christian theologian, Dorothea Zola, was a German woman. I talk in the book about how one day standing on the sidewalk, she told me she was afraid. This was about 1983 or so that we were talking on the sidewalk in front of Union Seminary in New York City. She said, Carter, I'm afraid that America is becoming a Christo-fascist nation. 1983, what is that, 41 years ago. And she was talking about that because of this gap between rich and poor, and because of the militarism of the Reagan administration, and because of the racism, and because the way abortion was beginning to be used to beat up on women. The Roe Wade was already under attack and so forth. Skipping to 9/11, the Afghan and Iraq wars, that's also part of what has brought us to where we are. Obama's election and presidency has played a huge role in getting us where we are, because the election of a Black president terrified so many Americans. Just terrified that a Black man could be elected president of this country and could do well and could be very widely received and applauded by so many people. And then, of course, domestic terrorism. I'm thinking of Timothy McVeigh, but he was not the only one back in the 90s and continuing and to this day with the school shootings and the like, often by what appear to be Lone Rangers, but they're part of a larger picture. They may be motivated as Lone Rangers, but there is a cultural landscape there that gives them the guns and encourages them to go forward. So, along with these kinds of events and movements, we've got the court decisions. Brown versus the Board of Education was terrified a lot of people in terms of integration and a way of life coming to an end. That's when private schools began to emerge, and a lot of homeschooling began to emerge. And a lot of churches were very upset about that, a lot of Christian churches. And then Roe Wade, almost 20 years later, comes along and gives women the right to exercise control over our bodies, making abortion legal in all states. Citizens United in 2010, which said that there is no limit to how much money corporations can put into our presidential elections and into our government. And then the three decisions that wound up legalizing same-sex marriage, and then the two decisions that wound up giving people a right to bear arms personally in their own homes. And then the Shelby versus Holder decision, which took away some of the voting rights that had been established as law in 1965 by John Roberts' statement that they were unnecessary. That this racism business, in terms of racism in the voting system, was a thing of the past, and therefore locales like the state of North Carolina did not need oversight any longer to make sure everybody got to vote. And then Hobby Lobby, which I think was the decision by the Supreme Court of saying that a private family that owns Hobby Lobby did not have to provide insurance for pregnant women. And then the Women's Health versus Jackson decision in 21, which in the state of Texas, they call the vigilante law, meaning that that people can be paid $10,000 if they report people who are seeking abortions. And then, of course, we get to the Dobbs decision, which overturns Roe. So let's go on to the next slide, Terry. And then came 2020, the pandemic and the big lie, both emerging in the same year. It's kind of hard to realize, isn't it? The devastating effects of the COVID-19 virus were exacerbated by the US president's refusal to take it seriously and by his all-out hostile dismissal campaign against everyone who did, including Dr. Anthony Fauci and other esteemed scientific, medical, educational, business, and religious leaders. His dismissal, Trump's dismissal of the pandemic as a fraud, being manufactured in China, you may recall, and embraced by his enemies, that would be Democrats, his political opponents. This fraud notion morphed into what would become known as the big lie, because by the time we get toward the election in 2020, he is already planning to challenge the election if it doesn't go his way, and knows that the lie can be used, knows that lies are effective, that it's okay to lie to get what you want. It's okay to lie to win regardless. So we have the pandemic giving Trump kind of a trial run for the big lie. And then next slide. I quoted Beth Moore here because she is an unlikely critic of Donald Trump because she was one of his chief supporters. But she said in 2020, I do not believe these days are for mincing words. I am 63 and a half years old, and I've never seen anything in these United States of America I've found more astonishingly seductive and dangerous to the saints of God than Trumpism. This Christian nationalism is not of God. So now, that's where we are then 4 years ago, and that's when the book was written, it began to be written. That's when Susan and I and our friends began talking about this with all of that kind of stuff as the backdrop. I want to look with you very briefly in a minute at the 7 deadly sins and point out that by sin, this is the next slide, Terry, by sin, I'm referring to a collective condition that shapes us collectively and not individual sin. So in other words, it's on all of us. It's no one of us that carries this sin. St. Augustine once referred to original sin as putting us all in the massa damnata, the damned mass, making us, here we are together. And I think that's a very vivid way of thinking of our problem. So none of us carries this alone. We're all in this together. And therefore, the emphasis of this book is on these sins as collective problems, not simply the problems of one or two people. So right now, we're just going to pay attention to the left-hand side of this column because on the right-hand side, we're going to talk about this a little bit later when we're all in a conversation about how we do this. But the sins, and let me add, if I were doing this again right now, I would have to add 2 sins, and therefore we'd have to change the name of the book because I don't know that I could eliminate any of them. But Christian anti-Semitism, I would add. And gun violence, I would make specific, not just violence, but gun violence, because I think the way guns are used in America is a particularly American phenomenon. Nowhere else in the world do they have the same kind of problem with guns, with AR-15s and with handguns and with these automatic weapons that can be taken and used against great numbers of people at one time without any control over them, without any gun safety laws. So gun violence and Christian anti-Semitism, which of course right now we could have another entire session. I think you all have already talked about this, on what's happening right now in our society and in the world around anti-Semitism and the Palestinian struggle for liberation and how these two are in such tension in the minds of so many people in this country as well as in Israel. But anyhow, that maybe is the next book, or maybe later in our conversation. But the lust for omnipotence and entitlement, I list as the first 2 sins, and I call those kind of sins of the spirit, because they cut through everything else. They are sort of, they are attitudes, but they shape everything that we do and everything that we say. The lust for power over is somehow an attribute to our character, that we need to be in control to be as fully human as possible. and that this cuts its way right through Christianity, as well as through the United States government, as well as through our cultural assumptions, and certainly through business. Um, Entitlement, that certain persons, usually white people, very often men, um, presumably straight men, often Christian men, are entitled to to have what is best or first or most. This has been true throughout U.S. history. It continues to be true in some terrible ways, that certain people are simply entitled to kinds of privileges that other people don't have. White supremacy, some people call that America's original sin, that whiteness is best, that whiteness, lightness, brightness is associated with God, with purity, with all that is best, and that we ingest that. What I was saying 20 minutes ago about being afraid of Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and Black Panthers and Black Power when I was a young woman, that didn't come out of nowhere. That came out of deep learning of white supremacist assumptions about goodness and evil. Misogyny, same thing in terms of women. Misogyny means the hatred of women. The form it usually takes is a kind of a fear of women and a derision of women and a trivialization of women. And there's not a woman alive, I think, who is in touch with herself at all, who hasn't experienced this in some form or another and knows it at some level, that we're simply not taken seriously too often. And it's not just the old Genesis thing about the woman made me eat the apple. It's not just that women always get the blame, but often we do get the blame. I've just pointed out what's going on with Kamala Harris in our public consciousness. That there's no question in my mind that a lot of the criticism toward her is because she's both Black and female. Didn't hear that kind of carrying on about Mike Pence. And we wouldn't hear it about any other white male vice president. So misogyny cuts so deep, and misogyny's first cousin is homophobia and heterosexism, that somehow, what does it mean to be a real man or a real woman? Well, it means not to be gay, for one thing, if you're a man or a woman, really, but male homosexuality is especially frightening in our culture, because it means this man is not a real man, and real men are valued so much in our society. Capitalist spirituality. Oh my goodness. When I've been discussing this with church groups, that's usually the one everybody wants to talk about for the rest of the time, because we are so wed to capitalism and so terrified of socialism. And when I say we, I mean we collectively. We individuals we may be democratic socialists like Bernie Sanders. I mean, we may have very different individual takes on capitalism and socialism, but as a nation, we are terrified of being anything other than capitalist. So Robert Reich, the great economist, has a suggestion, and that is, if we're so scared of socialism as a term, why not talk about democratic capitalism? Because democratic capitalism would be the same thing. It would mean that everybody in our democracy is getting a fair shake. Everybody has a chance. That would be democratic capitalism. I say in my book that I'm not foolish enough, even if I wanted to destroy capitalism or to think we could. Capitalism's here to stay, but we sure as heck can work towards its transformation, towards regulations, toward fair taxes, toward creating safety nets through which the poor cannot fall and will not fall. Really, really transforming capitalism into a humane system. The domination of the earth and creatures, goodness, how can there be any question that we humans see ourselves as a center of it all, the center of God, the center of God's world? What if we're not the center? What if we are here among the creatures and among the other humans, and that somehow we are here to be partners, to belong together? And in fact, that's what I talk about in terms of the response to the domination of the earth and creatures. picking up on some of the Buddhist teachings and some of my Christian ethicist friends talking about how we really need to belong more than we do and let others belong with us. And then finally, violence being a solution almost before there's a problem. That people love their guns. People don't know how often to settle disputes without imagining violence. It's all American. Look at all the Westerns most of us enjoyed when we were kids. Okay, let's move on to the next. Let me just let you read this for a minute, because I've come to this since I wrote the book. And so it's got a somewhat different feel to it. That white Christian nationalism, what's new is I'm saying it's being shared by a significant minority of Americans. In 2022, I thought it was a bunch of people way out there on the fringe. I now am aware that it's a lot of people who have bought into this. That our nation was founded by God to be under the authority of economically privileged white Christian men who should legislate, adjudicate, and govern our nation. Now, of course, there'll always be some token women and people of color and other religious traditions, but that basically these white Christian men and their allies should make and enforce laws and cultural standards, and that they will determine who will hold executive, judicial, and legislative positions, and who, if anyone, will vote to fill these positions. And move right on to the next, if you will, Terry. And just read what Paul Weyrich, who was the chief architect of the Republican Party and of white Christian nationalism, said as early as 1980. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting population goes down. Think about that. Think about that. That was said in front of hundreds of Christian evangelicals at a religious roundtable meeting in August of 1980. That has not changed. If anything, it's gotten more so and more intense now. No, that we don't want democracy. We want certain people to run this country and certain people to vote. Okay, next, Terry. And so what we get then are people like Mitch McConnell and Bill Barr, who were saying some time ago that Trump, look what Mitch McConnell said, Trump is practically and morally responsible for the events of January the 6th. And then shortly after voting to acquit then President Trump, he said that civil law would take care of this afterwards. You know that he said that. So we don't vote to impeach, we'll let the law take care of it. And now, of course, Trump is saying he's immune from all of this. Mitch McConnell is now saying it's abundantly clear that former President Trump has earned the requisite support of Republican voters to be our nominee for President of the United States. Bill Barr, to me, is even more astonishing. He said very recently, Trump's attempt to overturn the election is nauseating and disgusting. Someone who engaged in that kind of bullying about a process that is fundamental to our system and to our self-government shouldn't be anywhere near the Oval Office. And now he says, between Biden and Trump, I will vote for Trump because I believe he will do less damage over the 4 years. The threat to freedom and democracy has always been on the left. I think the real threat to democracy is the progressive movement and the Biden administration. Now that is quite something, I think. Do we have the next slide? So I just want to talk with you before we open this up for discussion and suggestions and whatever, and I do have some of those too, but I want to get your all's input first. I just want to end with this. The people, several years ago, I wrote a little piece in the Transylvania Times about fascism, and people said, you are nuts. We're nowhere close to fascism. This is not fascism. Authoritarianism is not fascism. Authoritarianism, maybe. Fascism, no. Well, I thought for this presentation tonight, I would try to explain what I believe the difference is between authoritarianism and fascism. Authoritarianism, like those first two deadly sins, lust, for omnipotence and entitlement is about style. It's not about the substance. It's the style of how a ruler acts. It's the rule of one person over everybody else. It's anti-democratic. Historical examples are Mao, Pinochet in Chile, Marcos in the Philippines, and Netanyahu today in Israel, and Castro. Excuse me. It does not describe an ideology. Authoritarianism can be on the left or on the right or at the center. Not all authoritarians are fascist. So that is where I think a lot of people assume we are right now. And that may be right. That may be where we are right now. I don't really want to argue about that. I'm just putting this up here for us to think about. Fascism is not simply about style, it's about substance. Fascists always hold right-wing ideologies, and they embrace the supremacy of the nation, the dominant race, and the male gender. Always. Fascism is always a right-wing ideology, and it focuses on purity, and it wants white people, Aryan people, men to be the rulers, and the nation, whether it's Germany or the United States or Italy or wherever, is to be made great and the greatest on earth. Fascism uses violence and fear rather than law, and to enforce its power. All fascists are authoritarian and anti-democratic, whereas the reverse is not true. And examples that we know from fascism in the 20th century were Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. These people were fascist. We're probably not there. I hope to God we're not there yet. But this is what we have to wrestle with, I believe, if we are serious about the 7 deadly sins of white Christian nationalism and want to say no to that, and yes to a God or a power, a sacred power of justice, love, working among us, or simply no to a moral force of justice and love working among us, whether or not we are believers in a God. Okay, I think, okay, this is how I'd like to sort of end and then let everybody in to start talking about this. And then before we end, if you'd like for me to, I do have some suggestions about what we can do if we wish as individuals and as small communities when we leave here. And let's see, what else do I have? Oh, and then I want to just read to you a little passage from my book as it ends, because it's a wonderful way to end. It's 2 other people talking to each other. But for now, how and under what conditions can such authoritarian leaders as Putin, Orban, and Trump become increasingly fascist in their obsessions with racial, ethnic, sexual, religious, and other forms of purity, making sure their people's blood is not contaminated, ridding their nation of vermin, increasingly determined to make their nation great again, ridding themselves of all who in any way threaten their power and control. Okay, we can take the slides away, Terry, and just talk to each other as a group.